Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Lamed Daled. Today's stuff is sponsored by Hannah and Michael Petrokowski in gratitude of President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the IDF, and to the people of Israel for persevering to bring home the hostages and Bezrat Hashem usher in the dawn of peace in our region. Still looking forward to the complete return of all of the bodies of the hostages. And with that, we'll get started. I'll just remind you, if you didn't have a chance yet, I know it's been a busy season with the holidays and all that, but there's lots of interesting content this week. The issue of women in shechita, interesting topic, which is why it was also covered by Din and Daf and also covered by Gefet. Women topics come up also, they're of particular interest often to us. And also, speaking of women, flashback was also about a woman, about Izebel. A bit of a different direction, but if you have time, you can print that for Shabbat. And if you have time while you're cooking, whatever, getting ready for Shabbat in other ways, you can try to listen to some of the other shiurim. Okay, remember the whole idea of Beyond the Daf is we don't always get to go into all these topics, and sometimes it gives you an opportunity to kind of zoom out and get the perspective. Well, I want to start today, we have a study guide, and I want to start today with a review of yesterday's daf, just to kind of get the end of yesterday's daf down pat, not just because it's good to review, which is always good, and it was a little bit confusing, but also because it's going to be very connected to what we're learning today. So we're going to start at the top of the study guide, which I did for the end of yesterday's daf. So we started with Reish Lakish according to Ulla. And I say that specifically because today we're going to deal with, we had this contradiction to what Ulla said. We're going to resolve it in three different ways. So yesterday we resolved it in one way, which Ulla responded himself and resolved the contradiction, which we'll review right now. When we get to Amud Bet of today's daf, it'll take us a little while, right, till we get there, but when we get to Amud Bet, we're actually going to have two other resolutions of the contradiction. In fact, you can look down at the bottom of the study guide on the first side of the page. I put it in a chart, kind of what the contradiction is, so maybe we'll go there for one quick minute, which is Reish Lakish, according to Ulla anyway, said the Tameh shechniseh do lifnim, if the Tameh person, impure person, puts his hand inside, loke, he gets lashes. Now, we assume that means, right, why does he get lashes? Well, if you remember, if you get karet for something. Now, anyone who goes into the temple gets karet. And what Reish Lakish's chidush is, not even if you put your whole body or most of your body in the Azara, and as we're talking about in the Azara area of the temple, but even if you just put your hand in, and he doesn't say you get karet, he says you get lashes. But we know that, or maybe you don't know, but if you're supposed to get karet for something, now karet is a God-given punishment, so in the courts, they'll give you lashes for it. So we assume this means you get karet because it says in the Pasuk, B'chol kodesh lo tiga ve'el mikdash lo tavo. And just like touching, Chol kodesh lo tiga, don't touch any sanctified items, you're going to, right, it's a problem just for touching, even touching with your finger a little teeny bit. Ma nigia b'miktzat is nigia, also bia b'miktzat is bia, because the Pasuk juxtaposes not touching kodshim and going into the temple. So that's what Reish Lakish says. The problem is that we brought this source, this braita, about a mitzora, a leper, who's on the 8th day, it's Erev Pesach, they're supposed to do their process of purification by putting their ear, their finger, and their toe inside the temple, getting that, with blood on it. And there it says, and then they became a Tvul Yom, right? They became a Baal Keri, and then they went to the mikvah on that day, and now they have a problem. Because why? Okay, now remember this, two parts. The problem is they can't even go onto the Temple Mount because Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, is forbidden to, right? You have to, it's not forbidden by a prohibition. It's a positive commandment, which is, Vayishalchu min hamachaneh, send out of the camp anyone who's impure. And the Baal Keri, one who had a seminal emission, can't be in the Temple Mount. So now, what's the issue? Well, they said, you know what? We're going to override that aseh because that aseh, that positive commandment of send out of the camp, doesn't have any karet associated with it. And we're going to say, but the aseh of Pesach is so much more important because if you don't do it, you're going to get karet. So bring him back in. Remember, there's no Pesach Sheni for someone who's keri. There's only Pesach Sheni for a Tamei Meit. So basically, we want to allow this person to do Pesach, so we'll override the aseh. But wait a minute. Forget that. They now have to put their ear and their finger and their toe into the temple, into the Azara. That is a karet issue because what did we say, right? Going into the temple is karet. And if bia b'miktzat is bia, as Reish Lakish said, then that's karet. That's a low taseh that is karet. Forget about an aseh that doesn't have karet. How can you override Pesach? How can you override, a negative commandment that has karet associated with it in order to do Pesach, which has karet? In other words, those are, right, first of all, that's even an aseh, not a low taseh, and even so, they're equal. It's not like, we'll push off the lighter one. It's not lighter. So it must be bia b'miktzat is not bia, and that's what we allowed. So a resolution we had was that Reish Lakish said tzarad is different because ho'il v'hutar l'tzarato hutar l'kiruyo. Since we permit a mitzorah, now mitzorah is no different from the Baal Keri in that sense. None of them can go into the Azara. And bia b'miktzat we could say is bia, but what? The mitzorah is in a different place because there's a special dispensation for a mitzorah, and therefore since we allow it because he's a leper, we'll override the Keri also, the seminal emission issue. That's what we said, okay? Then we got off on a sidetrack, which I kind of charted out here, but we're not going to go through it now, which is Rav Yosef said, from there you get to this case of the Zav, who became, most of the people were Zavim, and then they became Tmei Meitim, and then we went in through that, and then Abai said he had two difficulties. He resolved the first one by saying just flip the case to make it really parallel, but then he brought a second thing, which is you're comparing heter and dechia, and that's two different things. Okay, and then Rava said, I disagree with your logic. I could say the logic the other way. In other words, I agree. One is dechuya, one is hutra, but one is a heter, one is pushed off. But still, right? I can vouch for what Rav Yosef said. I can provide logic for it. Okay, that was what we got up to. Now, you can follow along in the study guide. I'm going to stop sharing it right now because it's not as critical. The last point of that was all a parenthetical statement of Rav Yosef, which is once Ulla makes this statement, since hutar l'tzarato, hutar l'kiruyo, since it's permitted because he's a leper, we'll also permit the Keri, the seminal emission, we'll overlook that. That got Rav Yosef off of this tangent, and we'll just end with this one line, Michlal de travayu sfira lahu tuma dechuyi betzibor. What you see here, and this is a very important statement, there's a big machloket, as I mentioned. Is truma hutra betzibor or is it dechuya betzibor? Is truma completely permitted as heter, hutra, when we have the majority of the people impure, or is it overridden? Okay, it's pushed off. Now, what's the difference? Well, the main nafkamina people talk about here is that, let's say we have a situation where the majority of people are tmeim. They're impure. We're going to allow the Korban Pesach to be brought because of that. So now, what do? Well, if Tuma is hutra, and it's as if it's not there anymore, we kind of ignore it, right? It's like we erased everyone who's tamei, it's as if they're pure. Then when we go to find kohanim to do the avoda in the temple for this, doesn't matter if they're pure or impure. We don't have to go searching and seeing, maybe, because we said the majority of the people, maybe there's kohanim who are pure, but who cares? Because all the impurity is as if it's purity, right? We don't care. But if we say Tuma is dechuya, we're going to override it. Then it means the Tuma is still there. We allow it. But if we're going to allow it, well then let's do it in the best way possible. Let's try to find a Kohen who's pure at least to go into the temple. Don't add more impurity to the situation. So if we can find, you have to go searching. Yes, you have to go searching according to that opinion, which now we see. Both Rav and Abai, who were very big, right, we know scholars of their time, they both hold on that side of the machloket. Okay, they both think that Tuma is dechuya, which would mean, let's say, for example, that you'd have to go try to find a Kohen who's pure if you can. If you can't, you can't. But if you can, you can. Right? I'll give you a better nafkamina of if we took this to a different place, like Shabbat, for example. Say pikuach nefesh toches Shabbat. Pikuach nefesh overrides Shabbat. What does it mean it overrides? Is Shabbat still there for that person? And therefore try to do it in the least problematic way possible. Try to not do malacha d'oraita, or try to find a non-Jew to do it. Or do we say it's completely permitted? Do anything you want, right? And don't start thinking and don't start, right? It's a big issue. How do we view that, right? In general, we say you can do what you can if it's pikuach nefesh, it's really saving a life. But, it depends how you view it about what, where you side on that. So anyway, that's a question that comes up there as well. Lema misayali. So now we're going to say, wait a minute. Let's bring, okay, so we now have this statement of Reish Lakish that Ulla said, which is, you just put your hand into the temple, you get lashes. So, and which basically means, in other words, bi'ah b'miksat shma bi'ah. A coming into the temple partially, even a little bit, is as if you came into the temple completely, and, you're going to completely prohibit it. And presumably you're going to get karet for it. So, lema meseale. Let's bring a proof for this statement of Reish Lakish. Kol smichot shayu sham, any smicha that was done in the temple, okay, this goes back to a topic we talked about yesterday. Korea lehem ani, I say about them, meaning the Torah really says about them, techef l'smicha shchita. Smicha has to be done immediately before shchita, meaning you can't have some sort of break between doing the smicha, putting your weight on the animal, and the slaughtering. Why? Because it says v'samach v'shachat. Remember, one goat comes right after the other. From there, they learn that means the animal has to be placed for smicha in the place where you're going to slaughter it. So, for example, if it's supposed to be in the tzafon, like kodesh kodshim, then the northern part, then the smicha has to be done there as well. Chutz mizo, but there's one exception to the rule. What's the one exception? Chutz mizo shaita b'shar Nikanor. One of them was done in the gates of Nikanor, the Nikanor gate, which was the entrance on the east side, right? Because the entrance is on the east, to the temple, okay, to the Azara. At the entrance to the Azara, they would do which one? We know which one. The Metzora can't go into the temple. So basically you're going to slaughter it inside, where? On the north side. But the smicha doesn't happen on the north side because the person has to do the smicha, the Metzora. And the Metzora can't walk into the Azara and be on the northern side of the courtyard because they can't, because they have to sprinkle the blood of their korban before they're allowed into the Azara. They're mechusar kippurim. Now, what's the issue here? If we say techef l'smicha shchita, and then you should be able to, right? You should be able to. You can't go. Right, you need to go in, but you can't go in this case. Well, if you say that going in partially is not actually going in, then why don't, like we talked about yesterday, why doesn't he just put his hands in and do the smicha from the gate? So let him stand at the gate, put his hands in, have the animal on the northern side, ready for slaughtering, have the person put their hands in, and great. In other words, that should work. The fact that we don't do that and we don't allow him to put his hands in, and we actually don't have the smicha right before the shechita, and we have this exception to the rule, proves that bi'ah b'miktzat is bi'ah, and we don't want his hands going in. And that's why we don't allow smicha that way, and we put the animal outside in the gate and not inside on the northern side. So, if we don't, right, if you say it's not bi'ah, then le'al yadiv elismoch, should put his hands in, do smicha, but yet we don't allow that. Must be bi'ah b'mitzah, is a problem. But Rav Yosef is going to reject this proof for one of two reasons. We're going to bring two different versions of Rav Yosef's rejection. Now you might remember we had a whole machloket about where is the tzafon. And as we know where the tzafon is, right? You walk in the gate and you're already, right? If you go to the right, that's the northern side. So that's what the premise of that question was. Right? You could theoretically do the slaughtering right there, it will be tzafon. But if you remember, we had a big machloket. Which area, going from east to west in the room, is considered the north? The north for, not the north, but the north for where slaughtering is allowed. Now it says in the pasuk, you have to slaughter kodesh kodshim al yerech hamizbeach tzafona, opposite the altar on the northern side. So if you remember, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says, it has to be only where the altar is, and that's 22 cubits into the room. Okay, now people's arms don't extend 22 cubits long, right? That's not possible. First of all, a cubit is the bottom part of your arm. So basically, there's no way you could get to 22 cubits and reach your arms across. So that's what Rabbi Yosef says. Ha'amane, that source that we just quoted, this braita for Reish Lakish, is not a support for Reish Lakish, because it said, according to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Ta'amar merachak tzafon. He says that tzafon is far from the entrance to the Azara. If you remember, what were the three opinions? Three opinions were, is it just the area opposite the Mizbeach, which would be 22 cubits into the room, which means you couldn't possibly stand outside and do smicha with your hands inside, which means this has nothing to do with biyah b'miktzat. This is just technically impossible. Oh, okay. The other opinion, just to remind you, was is it also extend all the way to the entrance, to the Ezrat Yisrael, and then the Ezrat Kohanim? Remember, the first 11 cubits are Ezrat Yisrael, the next 11 cubits are Ezrat Kohanim. Does it extend all the way to that area? And up until the altar. And then there was a third opinion that it starts from the beginning, extends all the way there, and even beyond the altar, all the way to the Ulam. Okay? To that entrance area, the hallway that leads to the Heichal. Anyway, if you say this Rav Yosef, the issue has to do with practical. You can't reach it, and not that it's biyah b'miktzat is biyah. Then the Gemara says, okay, wait. If you're going to say that, the braita, there was another resolution. If you really want to take seriously this techav l'smicha shrita, which they assume is a Torah law, so you should take it seriously. But you don't want to allow the mitzvah to go into the Azara. But biyah b'miktzat is not biyah, so you could have him extend his arms in. Then le'ad, like Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, if we say that, if we take what Rav Yosef said, basically saying this doesn't prove anything about biyah b'miktzat, you could actually extend your arms, and just it won't help you, because we hold by Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda that tzafon was too far. Le'ave pishpash. Why don't you make a small opening in the wall on the northern side, opposite the altar? In other words, there were little entranceways into the Azara from other places. So why don't you just make one that's right there on the northern side? Make a little entrance, have the Mitzorah stand there, and put his arms in. And that way, it's not far, it's not 22 cubits, it could be right there, it could be in the north still, it could be right where they're going to slaughter it. It would be perfect. So, Abai v'Rav Damri Travayu, you can't just do that and say, oh, let's just make another entranceway, because Hakol b'chtav miyad, we're quoting a pasuk in Chronicles, Hakol b'chtav miyad Hashem alai skil kol melechet hatavnit. It was all written down. There was a blueprint for how the temple was to be created. You can't just say, oh, let's just add in another opening. You can't just do that. It's like when you try to, you want to add a window in your house. I know in Israel anyway, you have to get permission from the Iriyah to do that, from the municipality. You can't just open things the way you want. Apparently, in the temple, it was no different. But obviously the temple had much more sanctity, much more reason to think you would have to do, you'd have to check, there would have to be part of the original plan. So, fine. That explains, but again, we're back to, that was just a difficulty on Rav Yosef's answer, but that was Rav Yosef's rejection of this being a proof. Ika da Amri, second version of Rav Yosef. Amar Rav Yosef, so some people say that Rav Yosef had a different proof. Why couldn't you put your arms in? Not having to do anything with biyah b'miktzat, but it was because when you do smicha, he held that you have to have your whole body inside. Why is that? My timer. Kol kocho be'inan. You need all your strength to go on the animal. When you're doing when you take your hands and you put them on the animal, you're supposed to put all the pressure of your body on it. Like, really. Not just, if I extend my hands into the Azara and do smicha, it's going to be like a little tap on the animal, with a little bit of strength. It's not going to be with all my strength. If you want to do all your strength, you have to be standing right next to the animal. So that wouldn't be smicha if we did it with your hands inside. Hilkach lo efshar, there'd be no way to do it properly. So that's why we have to do the Asha Mitzorah, we have to have the animal outside by the gate and not inside. Because there's no way, we can't allow the person to go in completely, we can only allow them to bring their hands in. And that's why biyah b'miktzat, according to Rav Yosef, could be biyah, is not necessarily biyah, is not necessarily a problem, it could be fine. But the braita still doesn't allow smicha that way, because you can't do smicha with just your hands inside. Okay, so that was two possible rejections of Rav Yosef of the proof. Now we just have a side question on the braita. Maika Savar, this author of the braita who said, that the smicha is always done right next to the shechita, except in the one case of the leper. Well, why? What does he hold? And here comes the question. If you say that this Asham Mitzorah is a Torah law that you need smicha, okay, now we start entering into something else, which we didn't talk about, which is, where do we get that the Asham needs smicha? Not every korban required smicha. Now, the korbanot chatat in general, sin offerings, not guilt offerings, sin offerings, required smicha, according to the Torah. It says it. That's the samach v'shachat, by the way. That was in korban Ulla, which is, that was in Ulla, not a chatat. But sorry about that. But the chatat also needs smicha. Now, how do we know asham needs smicha? Well, we learned, this goes back to things we learned earlier in the Masechet from the first Mishnah. If you remember, the first Mishnah was all about lo lishma. Let's try to remember. And there's only 2 disqualifications in the lo lishma. There's Pesach and chatat, according to Tanakama. And Rabbi Eliezer said also the asham. And why? Because kachatat kasham, right? Remember? There's this pasuk in the Torah that says, the chatat, what's true for the chatat is true for the asham. Now, since the chatat needs smicha, also the asham needs smicha. So if you say, so we assume that's a Torah law, that what's true for the chatat is true for the asham, so that would apply to smicha as well. Chatat needs smicha, asham needs smicha. So if asham needs smicha by Torah law, that's step 1 in the argument. And techav l'smicha shchita is doraita, and we just learned v'samach v'shachat is a Torah law, right? It's derived from the Torah. That smicha has to be as close as possible to the shchita, meaning no time lapse. That means the animal has to be placed in its appropriate place already. So we have number 1, the law of smicha for asham is Torah law. The law of having the smicha happen right by the shchita is Torah law. Well then, leo v'lismach le'edia derachman amal. Then we could say, look, now let's go back to yesterday. Remember we said the Mitzorah can put his ear in, even though you might say biyah b'miktzad is biyah, but the Torah allowed it. That was Ulla's whole answer. Remember? Hutar l'tzarato. This is a special dispensation. The Torah says you have to do it. So that means you have to do it, even though it means you're actually part of your body is going into the Azara. Right? There were 2 ways to read it. One was to say, well, there's no problem putting part of your body in the Azara. But if you say putting part of your body in the Azara is a problem, then you'd have to say there's a special dispensation. The Torah says you have to do it, even though, right, it's counterintuitive, but the Torah says you have to do it, so you have to do it. So if the Torah says you have to do smicha, and the Torah says smicha has to be in your shchita, then Torah is saying, let the leper go inside and do the smicha on his guilt offering. So that's the question. Why don't we just say, let the leper go in? Because the Torah said so. So we're going to have 3 versions this time of Rav Ada bar Matna. Okay, it's kind of 2 versions, but the second version we're going to say has a difficulty. We're going to change it to something else. So in the end, there are going to be 3 versions, but it's really like 2 versions that one of them just gets corrected. So I'm Rav Ada bar Matna. Gzeira shema yarbeh b'psiot. It's just a gzeira, meaning, okay, before we get to what his gzeira is, but really by Torah law, the leper should be allowed to go into the Azara and do smicha on the korban. So we really should theoretically, by Torah law, bring the animal inside, have him do smicha on it inside, even though he's a leper. But the rabbis are worried that shema yarbeh b'psiot. Psiot are steps. If we allow it, what does that mean? The Mitzorah is really not allowed in the Azara. So what are we going to say? The Mitzorah can walk in, go do his business, and come right out without taking any extra steps. But we're humans, and what happens? Someone starts to talk to him, he'll walk over there by accident, he'll take the long way to get there. We don't know, but whatever it might be, he might add extra steps that are not permitted, and that we can't allow. In other words, what's allowed by the Torah is the straightest, shortest line between entrance to animal. Maybe he'll make a mistake and ask, walk around. So therefore, we don't allow it. That's version 1. Version 2. Ikad Amri. Some people say, Amar Rav Ada bar Matna, smichad asha mitzorah doraita, but techav l'smicha shchita lav doraita. Now the premise of the question was that both these laws were Torah law. So now what we do here is, in version 1 of version 2 of Rav Ada bar Matna, we're going to say either version is going to basically say one of these things isn't doraita, but the question is which one. So first, the version that we have here says that techav l'smicha shchita isn't doraita. As the asham, you need to do smicha on this asham mitzorah. That's Torah law. But the fact that smicha has to be in your shchita, there has to be one just before the other, that's not a Torah law. Now, it's true we learned it from the verse in the Torah, but it's a drasha. Sometimes drashot are derabanan. And since it's only rabbinic, well, we're not going to allow the mitzorah to go into the Azara if it's rabbinic. So we'll allow it when it's doable. In this one case, it's not doable. But we're going to have a difficulty on this. Meitive, you can't say that because it's clear it's doraita. Because here's the drasha, one of the drashot we saw yesterday. V'samach v'shachat. Mas smicha b'torim. What's obvious to them here is that smicha is only with a tahor person. Someone who's tamei can't do smicha. Now, what's the premise of that? Why can't we learn this yesterday? Why can't someone impure do smicha? Because smicha has to happen inside, right, next to the shechita. And if that's the case, the smicha has to happen right before shechita, and that's why an impure person can't do smicha at all, then that would presume that techav the smicha shechita. Otherwise, we could just say, oh, have the tamei person do it outside the temple. So, again, let's go through the drasha. Mas smicha b'torin, af shechita b'torin. Just like smicha has to be only pure people, also shechita has to be only pure people. V'i amar lav d'oraita. If you say it's not d'oraita, b'tmei nami mishkachala. If it's not Torah law that the smicha has to be done right before the shechita, meaning inside, then just do the smicha outside and let an impure person do it. Okay, so that can't be. You have to say techav the smicha shechita is a Torah law. So what are we going to do? Do the opposite. Ele ipur, so say the opposite. Smichat asham mitzora lav d'oraita. Now we said it says kachata kasham. So how would you say that that's not by Torah law? And then, by the way, you say techav the smicha shechita is d'oraita. So we'll get to explaining it in a minute, but let's figure out why you would say it's not Torah. Well, it says kachata kasham, right? The guilt offering is just like the sin offering. Now, normally, guilt offerings are brought because someone does a sin, right? Likewise, sin offerings. They're both different types of sin offerings. So perhaps you could say, then in a case where the asham is for a sin, then it's exactly like the sin offering. And then you'd have to do smicha. But in the asham mitzora, a mitzora is a leper. That's a condition you have. You have to do a purification process. To bring korban asham as part of the purification process. But it's not an asham that's brought for a sin. Now, it's true, the Midrashim talk about that the leper did a sin and that's why they got punished. But the asham is not directly because you did a sin. It's just because that's part of, right, there's 3 korbanot he brings and one of them is an asham. And it's not a real guilt offering. So you could say that kachata kasham, the fact that pasuk says they're the same and the asham is going to need smicha, is when it's similar to chatat, that it's for a sin. This is not. So perhaps the requirement to do smicha on the asham is only required by rabbinic law, but not by Torah law. And then once you get it down to rabbinic law, then you could say, okay, for that we're not. Now, you still have techav the smicha shechita, but this isn't a Torah law smicha. So even though smicha is supposed to be done in your shechita, not when you're not really required by Torah law, and not when it conflicts with a different Torah law of not going into the Azara. So for that reason, that could explain, again, this was all to explain that difficulty in the braita, that if techav the smicha shechita is d'oraita and smicha of the asham is d'oraita, then why don't we just say the Torah said you have to do it and let the mitzvah go in? Well, we can't because one of them, right, and this time we changed it. It's specifically asham mitzvah is not d'oraita. Since it's not d'oraita, we're not going to allow this Torah law to be overridden of the leper not going into the Azara. Okay, so we had 2 resolutions in the end. Then one is really by Torah law he could, but we're worried shema yarbeh b'psiot, they might take extra steps and not go the most direct route. Or 2, really one of them is not Torah law, which in the end we said must be asham mitzvah is not by Torah law. So that was a side question, okay, just like yesterday, we got off on this side tangent of Rav Yosef saying, oh, if Ulla says that, then Ulla would say this too, and a whole discussion about that. We got off on a side about this braita. All we did so far today in terms of our major structure is we dealt with this braita we brought as a proof for Reish Lakish that bi'ah b'miktzad is bi'ah. In the end, we said you can't use it as a proof because Rav Yosef rejected it for one of 2 reasons, right? We brought 2 different versions of Rav Yosef, and then we got off on this tangent about the braita itself. Why can't the mitzvah go in? Now we're moving to Amud Bet. Ravina Amar. Now, as I told you earlier in the daf, but you might have forgotten, which is, now we're going to go back to this contradiction. Okay, let's just review it very briefly. If Ulla said in the name of Reish Lakish that Tamei Shechnis Yado is going to get lashes because that's bi'ah b'miktzat is bi'ah. That's going into the temple. And then we brought this braita about, right, better, right, let's override, better to have the aseh sheyesh bo karet yidcha aseh she'en bo karet. But what about the lo taseh of karet, of bi'ah b'miktzat? How do we allow this Baal Keri, who's on the 8th day of his tzarat thing, and it's Erev Pesach and wants to bring the korban Pesach, how do we allow him to go into the Azara? So Ulla said, don't worry, that's not a problem, because it was a special dispensation for the Mitzorah. We're going to apply that also for the for this person who's also a Baal Keri. Since he's both a leper and a Baal Keri, we're going to permit it. Okay, that was answer number one. I'm going to share my screen again, and I want to show you on the chart. Okay, we're down here. So we have this contradiction, and this is why the chart's important, because the first answer basically dealt with the braita. In other words, it said, oh, don't worry about that braita. Okay, we're going to leave Reish Lakish intact. Bi'ah b'miktzad is bi'ah, and right, the tamei shechnis yado lokeh. But, oh, you think this Mitzorah issue is a problem? That's a unique dispensation for Mitzorah, and that'll apply even if he becomes a Baal Keri. Now, Ravina gives a different answer, and both Ravina and Ravin, who are going to bring answers here, are going to relate to what Reish Lakish said. Okay, what Ulla said, Reish Lakish said, and resolve it on that side of the issue. Okay, we'll see in a minute. Ravina Amar, Le'inya Malkot Itmar. Okay, and then the braita is going to stay intact, as really saying, okay, we're going to see. It's still not going to say Bi'ah b'miktzad is not Bi'ah, but we're going to have a different issue, which is Le'inya Malkot Itmar. What does that mean? Well, maybe we will somewhat keep it intact. Tamei shechnis yado lifnim lokeh. Notice it didn't say gets karet, right? And then the whole problem was, if it's karet, right, then why don't we can't possibly say, oh, let's just allow it, and it'll, right, because of the karet of Pesach, and override this coming into the temple, which has karet. Now, this very interesting answer. He says, what Reish Lakish is saying, notice he says lashes, right? We all knew he said lashes, but we thought that because it relates to karet. No. If you go into the temple completely, you get karet. But if you just put your hand in, you're in an in-between stage. If we have a scale, right, there's not going into the temple at all. Okay, obviously you're good there. We have going in partially, and we have going in completely. So now we say going in partially, you just get lashes. Okay, it's not the isur that's the severe karet isur, which now makes sense. Back to the braita. The aseh that has karet is not going to be dochen aseh she'en bo karet, or a lo taseh that has lashes, so to speak. Because we're not going to allow, right? We're going to say, we're going to allow this not so severe thing, which is bi'ah b'miktzad. It's in between, right? It's not nothing that we thought before, according to this source. It's not nothing, but it's only lashes. So now they go hand in hand. Because now we're going to say bi'ah b'miktzad is not completely like bi'ah. It's partial. Just like it's partial, right? The prohibition is partial. It's not as severe. And then we can explain the braita and Reish Lakish in the same way. You know, they work together. That's answer number two. Answer number three. Ki ata Ravin amar Rabbi Avau. Okay, this is a totally different answer, and this is going to get us off on a completely different topic. Not completely, but somewhat different topic. He's going to basically say that what Ulla said Reish Lakish says is not what Reish Lakish said. When he said, we learned from B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga that a tamei shechnis yado gets lashes because right, bi'ah is like nigi'ah, and since the end of the pasuk said B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga ve'ela mikdash lo tavo, don't come to the temple. So B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga is partial, and coming into the temple then also partial. Okay, that was what we thought he said. Now we're going to say, no, he was talking about tamei shenaga b'kodesh itmar. Okay, he was talking about a different topic. When he said someone gets lashes, it wasn't tamei shechnis yado lifnim. It wasn't a tamei who puts his hand in. It was a tamei that touched sacrificial meat, okay, or a sacrificial item, a kodesh. Okay, now, how do we know this? To itmar, as it says. Now we're going to get into this big machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So, Tamei shenaga b'kodesh, and this is going to start us on a slew of debates between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, as you can see charted out here. Most of these are in tomorrow's daf, but I just brought the chart so you could see. Tamei shenaga b'kodesh Reish Lakish amar lokeh, Rabbi Yochanan omer eno lokeh. If a tamei person touches sacrificial items, according to Reish Lakish, he gets lashes. Okay, that's in this bottom chart here. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he doesn't get lashes. Now, this is a bit strange. How could Rabbi Yochanan say he doesn't get lashes? It says b'chol kodesh lo tiga. Any lo taseh that's associated with an action, here the action is don't touch it, should get lashes. So how are we going to explain Rabbi Yochanan? Reish Lakish is very intuitive. And now what we're going to say is, this statement that Ulla quoted in the name of Reish Lakish was not really what Reish Lakish said. Reish Lakish said there, instead, tamei shenaga b'kodesh lokeh. So we're going to change those first words. Tameshin agaba kodesh, and now we can continue, right? Lokeh, because it says b'chol kodesh lo tiga. Okay, you have to forget the makish bial and nigia and all that, okay? And basically he just said, you get lashes for touching sacrificial items. Now what we're left to explain is, so we have a few things to explain, but the first is, what does Rabbi Yochanan do with that pasuk, b'chol kodesh lo tiga? If he doesn't think you get lashes, then what's the lotas say here? Any negative commandment should get lashes. So Reish Lakish amar loket, why b'chol kodesh lo tiga? He understands that pasuk literally. Rabbi Yochanan amal eino loket. Hahu b'truma ktiv. He says that pasuk b'chol kodesh lo tiga, kodesh is not kodashim, sacrificial items. It's something else that's kodesh, which is truma. Don't touch truma. Okay, now here's a little something strange. Truma is actually more severe than kodshim. So if you can't touch kodshim, then you obviously can't. If you can't touch truma, then you obviously can't touch kodshim. How do we know? We were just talking about truma, right? Remember we said there's a shlishi for truma, right? Sheni only goes, right, for chulin there's only sheni, but truma goes to shlishi. Kodshim goes to revi'i. There's even an extra level of truma. Kodshim are for sure more severe. But there's a principle. You can't learn a punishment by a kal v'chomer. So if you say the pasuk is talking about truma, and that's the prohibition, and then there's a pasuk basically that's going to say if you eat, well, whatever, we'll get there. But if you say that's a prohibition, there's the concept of emas hirim minadin. You can't even learn a lotase or a punishment, right? The punishment would be lashes here. You can't learn a punishment by kal v'chomer. So if you touch truma, you're going to get lashes, but actually, ironically, you're not going to get lashes for touching kodshim. Okay, even though it's more severe, because you don't learn punishment from a kal v'chomer. So that's the machlok of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. And again, backtracking, that's the third resolution to this contradiction by saying what Ulla said, Reish Lakish says is not what Reish Lakish said. Reish Lakish, when he said there's someone here who gets lashes about a tamei person in the temple, we're actually talking about a person who touches sacrificial items and not a person who went into the temple. And it has nothing to do with biyah b'miktzat, and then we resolve it like that. Now, here comes the question of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, Hi kralahachi uda'ata? Hi mebaile. How could you say that pasuk b'chol kodesh lo tiga, even though it looked pretty simple? It's talking about don't touch kodashim, which is the simple reading. But Reish Lakish says elsewhere that pasuk is coming for something else. What's it coming for? I'm going back to show the study guide. That pasuk is coming for Azara. If you notice in the top chart here, b'chol kodesh lo tiga is a warning for a tameh shenaga b'kodesh. It's a warning. To le'ochel basar kodesh. It's coming for someone who eats sacrificial meat. Now you see here it comes for both. But the question first is going to be, how could it come for both, right? It's either one or the other. Then the Gemara is going to actually prove that it actually comes for both. That's going to be the answer. But first we're going to say, how could it come to teach you about a tameh that touches kodshim when it teaches you about someone who eats kodshim? Now it's a little bit strange to say it eats because it says lo tiga, don't touch. Don't touch means don't touch. It doesn't mean don't eat. So now we're going to see. So the question is, let's read it again. Reish Lakish, Hi kralahachi uda'ata. That pasuk is coming to say a tameh shenaga b'kodesh. What do you mean? Hi mebai, like he needs that pasuk for a different lo tase. Azara la'ochel basar kodesh, for someone who eats basar kodesh. De'itmar, as it was said. Another machloka between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Now here, they both think that you get lashes for it, for eating sacrificial meat. Obviously, we're talking about not any person eating it if you're impure. But how do you know? Because remember, what's that pasuk talking about? The Yoledet, who's still impure because she hasn't finished her sacrifices yet. De'itmar. But the machloket is, what's the warning pasuk for this? Azara la'ochel basar kodesh minai. Now, obviously, Rabbi Yochanan can't learn here to eating basar kodesh because he says that pasuk is talking about truma. It's not even talking about sacrificial items. So for sure he can't get to that. So where do they get it from? Reish Lakish amar b'chol kodesh lo tiga. That's our pasuk. Okay? And that's how we know that he says it's for ochel basar kodesh. So we're in the middle of this question because we don't have the answer yet. How's he going to learn also about an impure person who touched kodshim when it's really coming about an impure person who eats kodshim? So Rabbi Yochanan, what's his source? First, let's just finish that, and then we'll get to the answer. Tani bardela, atya tumato mi biat mikdash. There's two psukim that talk about punishment, one for eating sacrificial items when you're impure, and one for coming to the temple. And both use the word tumato. And because of that, we're going to make a gzera shava from one to the other, and we'll see where the gzera shava goes in a minute. But let's read the psukim. Vayikra Zayin Pasuk Kaf is talking about eating kodshim, and it says there, Sorry, if you eat basar, and you're impure, that's exactly what we're looking for. You get curry. Now notice what's missing in that pasuk. There's no lo ta'aseh. It just says, if you do it, you will get curry. So we know there's a punishment. But if you remember, we had this a lot with the arayot, with the forbidden relations, that in order to get punished, there needs to be, number one, a warning pasuk in the Torah, right? Especially if you want to give lashes, which is what we're talking about. You have to have a warning, don't do something, and then you have to have a punishment. So we're always looking, okay, there's the punishment, where's the warning? Or there's the warning, where's the punishment? So here we have the punishment, we don't have the warning. But in Bamidbar Yuteh Pasuk Gimel it says, Kol hanogea b'meit b'nefesh adam. This is coming to the temple. Okay, B'yat Mikdash, this is going to be the other part of the Gzera Shava. If you touch a dead body, you come in contact with a dead body, Asher Yamut, V'lo Yitchatan, then you don't purify yourself. At Mishkan Hashem Timei, you desecrate the place of God. That means if you go into the temple, you desecrate it, right? So you became impure of the dead, you didn't go through a purification process, and you went into the temple. You're going to get punished with curry. Notice they're both curry. And then it says at the end of the pasuk, od tumatobo. So there you have tumato there, you have tumato there. This is also just a pasuk, no warning. But where's the warning for B'yat Mikdash in our pasuk? B'chol kodesh lo tiga ve'el hamikdash lo tavo, and don't go to the temple. So there's a clear warning. Don't come into the temple, and if you do, you'll get curry. We have the warning, we have the punishment. In eating kachim, we only have the punishment. We don't have the warning. So comes the Gzera Shava. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan quotes this braita Bardelai, who brings this braita Adir tumato tumatomi b'yat mikdash. Ma lahalan anashvi is here. Afkan anashvi is here. It's very strange. We always try to find a warning pasuk. How do we find it this time? In Gzera Shava. What do they say? Well, since in b'yat mikdash, coming into the temple, we have a warning pasuk and a punishment, and since in the punishment pasuk we have the same word that appears, we can make a Gzera Shava to eating kachim. So even though we don't actually have a warning pasuk in kachim, and it's as if you do from the Gzera Shava. Okay, it's a bit of a weird one. There really is no warning pasuk, but since B'yat Mikdash has a warning and a punishment, this one also has a warning and a punishment learned through Gzera Shava. Okay, so back to our question, which Rabbi Yochanan wasn't really what interested us. What's his source for the eating kachim? But what we did want to figure out is if Reish Lakish uses b'chol kodesh lo tigati eating basar kodesh, how does he learn from there a warning to a tamesh and a gaba kodesh, which is what Ravin said in the name of Rabbi Abahu? That's what Reish Lakish was talking about in this thing that Ulla quoted him, that you get lashes for, not for the other thing. And we also know there's a machlokah between him and Rabbi Yochanan about this. So it's got to be true, but how could he learn both? So as I told you before, we're going to learn both. Because tamesh and agab kodesh mida afka rachmana belashon negia, and azara laocha mida itkash kodesh lemikdash. Okay, we're going to learn both. How so? Well, the first we're going to learn because the Torah uses. Okay, if you say b'chol kodesh lo tiga, don't touch sanctified items, really means don't eat sanctified items. Well, then why did it use the language don't touch? So they use the language don't touch to teach you it's also forbidden not to touch them. Okay. Now, how do we know then? Okay, well then the simple reading would be it's really talking about don't touch. How did we get to don't eat? Well, and I'll read it again. Azara le'ochel midi itakash kodesh lemikdash. Since kodesh here is in the same pasuk as mikdash, it says b'chol kodesh lo tiga ve'el mikdash lo tavon. What did we just see in these other pasukim that we quoted for Rabbi Yochanan? Both you get karet for them. Now it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah, and it's not the case, that if you touch kodshim, you don't get, you're impure, you don't get karet. So therefore, since you don't get karet for it, when it says b'chol kodesh lo tiga ve'el mikdash lo tavo, we're juxtaposing two similar things. So the lo taseh must be relating to something that's similar to b'yat mikdash, just like that's karet, and therefore we learn both things. So let's start from the end. It's really talking about eating because it has to be something parallel to the next part of the verse, which is severity of karet. But why did it then say lo tiga? It should have said lo tochal. The fact it says don't touch means you also learn it's forbidden to touch. And now we're going to bring a braita to support Reish Lakish, which is going to say exactly this explicitly, this hakesh, which they didn't really spell out in the Gemara, but they're going to spell it out here in the braita. And this braita supports Reish Lakish that there's really a prohibition to eat kachim. There's a warning here in this pasuk and not where Rabbi Yochanan learned the warning from through Gzera Shava. B'chol kodesh lo tiga azara le'ochel. Here the braita says it. This is a warning for someone who eats. Okay? Wait, but why do you say it's eating, right? Classic Midrash Halacha. You say something and they say, who's to say that? Maybe it's really about touching, like it seems to be. Talmud Lomar, b'chol kodesh lo tigava el mikdash lo tavo. Again, they're going to show this juxtaposition now, and they're going to spell it out. Makish kodesh lemikdash. Ma mikdash davar sheyesh bo netilat neshama, av kodesh davar sheyesh bo netilat neshama. Both have to do with punishments that you will get killed for. Okay, you will get the death for. Death by God, but death. Okay, that's where we get it. So what's a review of our daf? Let's go quickly. We have, number one, this problem of Ulla brought up the statement of Reish Lakish in yesterday's daf. Rav Hoshaya brought a difficulty from a braita. We basically had 3 resolutions to that. Okay, with a big break in the middle of the first one to the next 2, but 3 different resolutions of contradiction. The third one, getting off on a totally different topic and saying, what Ulla said in the name of Reish Lakish isn't really true. It really was something else that he said, and that got us off on this tangent about a tameh shenagah b'kodesh. Okay, and then from that we got to, well, how could you say it's nogah b'kodesh if it's really ochel? And then we said you can actually learn both. Okay, and from that we got to also what's Rabbi Yochanan's source for that, and why does he disagree about that? Okay, and within that we had this attempt before that whole big break we had was an attempt to bring a braita to support Reish Lakish. In the end, Rav Yosef rejects it for one of 2 possible reasons, 2 versions of Rav Yosef. And then we got to the braita itself seems to have a problem. Why don't we allow the Mitzorah to come in? Right, that braita we brought about smicha. Why don't we allow him to go in if everything's doraita? And we said really either one isn't doraita or maybe there's a gzera d'Rabbanan not allowing, and it was all 3 different versions of what Rav Ad Ramana said. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.